through the headlines with the journalist and author Christina Patterson and the editor of Spiked, Brendan O'Neill. So good evening to you two. So let's take a look then at what's on the front pages. And the Metro has the death of ITV presenter Caroline Flack on its front cover with the headline, "My heart is broken," after her boyfriend Lewis Burton shared a heartfelt response on social media. The Daily Mail shows the same photo of Caroline Flack with her boyfriend Lewis Burton, and the headline is "Flack feared a show trial," in reference, they say, to the trial she was facing for assault charges against Lewis Burton. The Daily Star features the headline "Lewis, my heartache," in response to his emotional social media post over the sudden death of his girlfriend Caroline Flack yesterday. A Daily Telegraph investigation reveals that dementia patients are being dumped in hospital emergency departments due to the closure of care centres right across the country. Time shows the devastation caused by Storm Dennis and has a story about European trade talks between Britain and the EU that are likely to turn nasty. That's according to a warning from France. The Daily Express also leads with trade talks between the EU and Britain on its front cover, claiming the two sides will rip each other apart. While the Financial Times leads with controversial plans for a new multi-billion-dollar investment fund at Japanese multinational conglomerate SoftBank. So Christina Patterson and Brendan O'Neill here with me tonight. And another day with a number of headlines focusing on the very tragic death of Caroline Flack yesterday. You've picked out the Daily Mail's headline tomorrow. The headline there says Flack feared a show trial, and a number of the papers starting to raise certain questions that the death appears to have thrown up.
Well, I have to say, I think it's just unbelievably sad. I feel incredibly sad about, I don't watch Love Island. I barely knew who Caroline Flack was, but when anyone decides that they don't want to live anymore, it's just desperately sad for them, for their families, for all who love them. And clearly she was very widely loved by many, many people, not least the people who watched her on Love Island and who followed her on Instagram. I think there are a number of issues that this raises, but the one I think we should be very careful about is the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service. There's been a very strong sort of backlash and feeling that this case should not have been prosecuted. And clearly she was feeling very, very anxious, as anybody would be, about the prospect of being found guilty and perhaps serving a prison sentence for assault. Her boyfriend had decided not to go ahead with, not to press charges once he didn't want the prosecution to go ahead, but he did report it in the first place. And I think, I'm not going to pronounce one way or the other, but I just think we have to be very careful in that area, because if a crime is reported, it's not really up to anybody to say, we don't want that prosecution to go ahead anymore. So I personally wouldn't, at this point, hurl culpability in that direction, where I absolutely do think that there are people who may well want to search their consciences now, are in the tabloid newspapers and on social media, people who were gratuitously unkind to her. And I think it is underestimated how very, very hard it is to live your life with a degree of public scrutiny, and to be under those kinds of pressures, particularly if you have any kind of propensity towards anxiety and depression, is very hard. And we all make mistakes. And if she was guilty of this assault, then obviously that was a horrible thing that happened in her life. But to have suffered so heavily for that mistake in so many ways, and ultimately in losing her life, I think is nothing less than a tragedy.
And of course, we can make absolutely no assumptions about guilt or innocence, because we just don't have the facts, and the trial didn't go ahead. What's your feeling? There are two issues that you talked about there. This issue of the CPS, Caroline Flack's management team criticised them for going ahead with the trial, given her vulnerable mental state. The CPS has issued a statement talking about how CPS prosecutors must review every case referred to us by police or other investigators. It is a difficult issue, isn't it? And to what extent should someone's mental state be a consideration, and to what extent should support be offered, do you think?
I mean, it's such a difficult issue. I mean, it is a complete and utter tragedy. Someone who was young, 40 years old, and incredibly popular, especially amongst younger people. My nieces and nephews are obsessed with Love Island, and they loved watching her. So it's really, really, really sad. I completely agree with Christina about the kind of desperate sadness of it. But I think I take the slightly opposite view to Christina in relation to the issues that are thrown up by it. So I actually think that the rush to blame it on the tabloids has been a bit too swift for my liking, and there has been, I think, in certain circles, there has been an attempt to use this awful tragedy to score a few political points against the tabloid newspapers, and particularly against The Sun. But what I think people are forgetting is that The Sun actually defended Caroline Flack over the past few months. They had a front page exclusive saying, why is she being mistreated by ITV? Why is she not being presumed innocent until proven guilty? So they actually took her side on a number of occasions over the past few months. I think one of the issues that is thrown up by this is I think it would be wrong to pursue prosecutions on the basis of whether it would impact badly on the person being prosecuted, because that's no way to carry out the law. But I do think the culture around accusations has to be called into question. And I think one of the problems in today's culture is if someone is accused of an offence, particularly an offence that is domestic or between two people or intimate, there is this instant condemnation. We have seen the erosion of the ideal of innocent until proven guilty. And very often today, when someone is accused of something, there is this instant rush to believe that it must be true. They did this thing, they're a bad person, there's no coming back, they have to be cancelled. So I think the fatalism of the cancel culture and the fatalism of saying, well, you've been accused of this thing and there's no smoke without fire and therefore you're questionable for a long time, that I think has a really detrimental impact on people's, potentially on their mental health and also on their lives. So you're absolutely right, Anna. None of us knows what was going on here, and suicide is a deeply complex situation which is usually driven by numerous factors. But I do think it's incumbent on all of us to ask questions about the culture that we might be contributing to and the impact it might be having on individuals.
Yeah, and as you say, innocent until proved guilty, and no trial happened. Let's move on to the front page of the Metro as well. And this is Caroline Flack's boyfriend has put a statement on Instagram, I think it was, saying my heart is broken and that he would be her voice. And picking up on some of those points, the other person that spoke out today was Laura Whitmore, who stepped in for her on Love Island, was a friend of hers as well, and talked very emotionally and movingly about some of the pressures that people in the public eye face, and talked about newspapers, but also talked about social media as well. And that call for people to be kind is one that we've heard repeated a lot today.
Well, that's right. And I do think, and as we know, there have been two other young people who have ended their lives from Love Island, which is a tragedy. I think the whole culture, actually, I mean, I know people voluntarily take part in these series, but it's very hard to know in advance what kind of toll it will take. If you haven't experienced what it is to be suddenly thrust in the public eye in such an intense way, I don't think anybody can imagine it. I mean, even doing our bits here, you get kind of really unpleasant abuse for days on end, and that's just a tiny taste of what some of these people have to go through. And many of them are very young, actually, and they haven't. Some of us have got a bit more battle hardened, but they haven't had that opportunity. I do think, I mean, human nature doesn't change, but I do think certain things in our society can nudge us in one direction or another. And although I'm not a kind of thunderingly anti-social media person, and there are aspects of it I enjoy very much, I do think that in lots of ways it has made us more cruel. I think people are very quick to rush to judgment. And there were also quite a lot of celebrities tweeting last night about how important it was to be kind. You know, celebrities who also quite swiftly slag off other people when they do anything wrong, as many of us on social media do. And I think it's a very fine line between, for example, criticising a politician's performance, as we will no doubt do later, which, you know, you and I would regard as our role. That's what we're here for, to cast that kind of critical eye, and making personal attacks on people to do with their appearance or their private lives or whatever. And I think as a society, we just need to get much better at navigating all of that.
Okay, and I'm sure that no doubt there will be a lot more coverage of this and more questions raised in the days ahead. But let's move on to one of the other issues that's been around this weekend. It's on the front page of tomorrow's Daily Telegraph. It's actually the second or third story on the front page, but it concerns the BBC, and there was a story in today's Sunday Times suggesting that that the government might be looking at the BBC and its funding in a different way. So what's being said in tomorrow's paper?
So apparently some backbench Tory MPs are concerned about what they refer to as the government's vendetta against the BBC. So Damien Green, for example, has said that it would be an act of cultural vandalism to destroy the BBC. I think that's an exaggeration, because I don't think anyone in government is out to destroy the BBC. I think what they are doing is raising actually quite important questions about how the BBC is funded and about the role it plays in the nation today. So the thing that Number 10 is apparently keen to push is the opening the question about the licence fee, whether it should be this compulsory fee that we all have to pay if you own a television, or if it should be a subscription model, which is what we have with Netflix and Amazon Prime and everything else these days. I think those are perfectly legitimate questions to ask. My personal view is that I think the BBC has watered down its objectivity and its neutrality over the past few years. It did risk.
And they, of course, would
they would completely
those.
disagree, and I'm sure they are. If any of them are watching now, they will be shaking their heads in fierce disagreement. I think it did become the Brexit bashing corporation for a while, and then of course Remainers completely disagree and argue that it became the pro-Brexit corporation.
Yes.
So that's all perfectly fine. But I do think the question of what a national broadcaster does and what its role is and how it relates to the nation, that has been thrown massively into question over the past few years. So I think it's legitimate to ask how it's funded and whether it's right that people can be imprisoned or at least arrested and criminalised for refusing to fund the BBC. That's an archaic system.
I would give more credence to your argument that there is no vendetta here if there weren't this boycott of the Today programme, Newsnight, all these kind of political programmes that exist to scrutinise the people who are meant to represent us. I think it's really shameful that our government are currently refusing to be held to account in that way. So I'm afraid I do think there is an element of the vendetta about this. I don't disagree that I think there is quite a lot of fat in the BBC. I think a lot of its so-called top talent is hugely overpaid on the entirely spurious view that there is a marketplace bursting with, kind of desire for these people. And I just don't think that is necessarily the case. I think there probably is a certain amount of duplication. I think probably some of the radio programmes could go, as has been suggested, but to actually boil it down to Radio 3, Radio 4, and then if you do make it a subscription model a la Netflix or whatever, what happens to that whole public service remit about representing every class, every region, minorities, diversity? The BBC is meant to be the voice of the nation. It may not do that well enough, but it will have no impetus to do that if it's entirely commercial like the other existing broadcasters.
I've got a feeling that you'd like to carry this on a bit longer. I'm so sorry, we're out of time in this section, so are going to have to go to a break. I'm sure we can come back to this debate another time. But let me tell you before we go to the break that there is going to be more on that Love Island story tomorrow as Kay Burley speaks to former Hollyoaks actress Stephanie Davis on why she's calling for stricter laws on the press around safeguarding celebrities in the public eye. That's tomorrow. But meanwhile, coming up here on the press preview in a moment, freedom for some of the quarantined cruise passengers, but others are still stuck on board. We're going to be looking at that in a moment.
Danny Joyce, and this is your showbiz news. A warning, there may be some flash photography coming up. Zoe Kravitz was joined by the cast of High Fidelity in New York for the show's first season premiere. Based on the 1995 Nick Hornby book, the series sees Kravitz play Rob Brooks, a record store owner who uses music to help her through relationships in life. The book was also adapted into a film in 2000, which starred John Cusack and Kravitz's mother, Lisa Bonet, as his girlfriend.
Rob's an interesting character. I think of her as me a couple, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, me in my early 20s. A little bit stunted, a little bit confused, someone that has to learn about themselves in order to move forward.
The board of the Caesar Academy, which distributes France's equivalent of the Oscars, has resigned amid a wave of criticism over its nominations of a film by Roman Polanski. Polanski is an officer and a spy, a film about a Jewish-French officer accused of spying for Germany in the 1890s, received 12 nods, which has angered feminist groups. The Polish-French director has been wanted in the US for the alleged statutory rape of a 13-year-old girl since the 1970s. The board's decision to step down comes ahead of the 45th awards ceremony in Paris, which is to be held at the end of the month.
Yeah, the fire in the park. Let's go. Try to see better than me. Tell my man shuts up.
Stormzy has rescheduled parts of his world tour due to the COVID-19 outbreak. The grime star said he would regrettably have to move a number of Asia gigs which were scheduled for March as part of his Heavy is the Head tour. The star said on Twitter that due to the ongoing health and travel concerns surrounding the coronavirus and having to reschedule this leg of the tour, he added, "I promise I'll be back." Mariah Carey has been confirmed as the headline act for Brighton Pride 2020. The singer will be taken to the stage on August the 1st, the organisers confirmed. The musician, who has had 19 #1 singles and sold more than 200 million albums, will play Pride in the Park. The spokesperson for the festival, Mr. Jepson, said signing Mariah had taken months of planning and organising. She follows in the footsteps of Kylie Minogue and Britney Spears.
Brits and what they might have. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview. With me tonight, journalist and author Christina Patterson and editor of Spiked, Brendan O'Neill. And we're going to turn to the issue of coronavirus, which once again features in the papers, as you would imagine. The Metro focuses on Brits and what they might do should the situation get worse. Is that right?
Well, I think the assumption seems to be that it will get worse. Let's hope not, but it's certainly spreading very, very fast in China, and the impression seems to be that the figures there have been rather underestimated. So we're being told that Brits who get flu-like symptoms may well be instructed to the new phrases self-isolate. Why they don't just say isolate themselves, I don't know. For 2 weeks. What I'm confused about is, does that mean if everyone who gets a snuffle or feels ill automatically has to self-isolate for 2 weeks? That's going to have a very, very big effect on the British economy. That's going to be a lot of people out of the workforce. I mean, it has been, one expert has predicted that this could well become a pandemic, which would mean that 60% of the population got infected. And if even only 1% died, that's still hundreds of thousands of people. So I think we have reason to be worried, unfortunately.
Well, yes, and I suppose we just have to wait for the advice as it comes from Public Health England. At the moment, they say that all the kind of preparations are being made and put into place.
Yeah, I think it is important we don't overreact. And I think one of the concerns is that if you do get a kind of a cold or you just feel slightly down, will people panic and think, oh my God, this might be coronavirus, maybe I should self-isolate? I do think, even though it's true that it could become a pandemic, I do think we need some perspective, and we need to recognize that at the moment it's okay-ish, and overreaction is probably not a good thing.
Okay, and a very quick look at the take on coronavirus and COVID-19 on the front of the Financial Times, because they have pictures there, presumably of US citizens being taken off the ship, the cruise ship where coronavirus, COVID-19 is present, and they're being brought home, but some Brits are concerned.
Well, there's a couple called David Abel and his wife, Sally, who've been on a golden wedding anniversary cruise, and they've been gamely posting videos from their cabin and trying to be upbeat about the whole thing. And now poor old David and Sally are understandably pretty fed up and feeling abandoned by the British government, which frankly it looks as if they have been. They say that they may well be facing another 6 to 8 weeks on the ship, while the other people on the ship seem to be being rescued if they haven't been infected.
This is the Diamond Princess in Yokohama.
Yeah,
I'm
so
going to
very
whiz us on
tough.
because we've got very little time, and I know that you were keen to talk about Rishi Sunak and the upcoming budget. The suggestion here that it could be delayed is due on March the 11th, which is no
Yeah.
time at all for a new chancellor.
And it might not happen because he's new. He's just taken over from Sajid Javid.
I'm sure it'll happen at some point. won't
It will happen at some point, but you know, I think that's fair enough. I think he's new in the job. He's been in the Treasury for a long time, but he's new in this particular job, and I think it's fine if he needs more time. I actually think the Rishi Sunak discussion is really interesting. The thing it really makes me think is that this whole idea that the Boris government is this racist far-right government is completely shot down by these appointments. You know, we've got Asian heritage people running the economy. Rishi Sunak running law in the shape of Suella Braverman, running national security with Priti Patel. This is actually an incredibly diverse government. So one of the things I think that people think is quite positive about this is that it does actually call into question the notion that we live in a racist, post-Brexit, crazy country. And actually there are some people from immigrant backgrounds who are doing a pretty good job if we give them the time to run this
On
country.
the other hand, I think
Christina,
something like
10 seconds on the phone.
66%, or is it 68% of the cabinet are privately educated.
That's true.
So if
Yeah.
we're talking
That's true.
diversity,
We need
we're
more
talking,
class stuff.
you know, these
I'm
people
gonna
went to
have to
public
stop you.
schools.
I'm so sorry to cut you off. Let's talk about this again at 11:30. I must bring in the weather because it's such a crucial
What's
story.
the weather?
in
We can
itself.
talk about politics.
Storm Dennis is very